Welcome all. I think we can get started. I assume you're here for the correct event. Nathan Thrall. That is Nathan Thrall. For those of you who don't yet have the book, the bookstore is actually selling copies of his books. If you get a chance, you might even be able to get the author to sign a copy. All right. So I'm Jonathan Graubart. I'm a professor a professor of political science at San Diego State. Have the honor or the dishonor of being chair of the department. So bringing Nathan Thrall to SDSU has been a decade-long pursuit of mine. I first invited him back in 2014 to speak on Israel-Palestine because I was impressed by the reports he produced for the International Crisis Group, which is a policy think tank dealing with security issues, and by the essays he wrote for various journals and newspapers, including The Guardian and the New York Review of Books. We failed to find an opening for him to make it from Jerusalem to San Diego, but I remained a follower and I assigned his essays to students in my class. In 2023, after my book came out on Jewish self-determination, I shamelessly reached out to various people, including Nathan Thrall, to get their support. Nathan gave his support, but more importantly, he shared a PDF of his just completed book at that point, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. I don't normally like reading books on PDF, but this was so gripping, I devoured it over the next few days. The book is it's a rich tale in one part of a family saga, of suffering, of romance, of sadness, of outrage. And it's a chronicle of the everyday life of everyday Palestinian life in the occupied Palestinian territories. So as such, the book really brings out the richness of Palestinian society living under occupation, while also giving depth to a range of Israeli Jews. Don't just take my word for it, however. I'll read from a few blurbs. Those are always fun. From Adam Hochschild. It is hard to think of another book that gives such a poignant, deeply human face to the ongoing tragedy of Palestine. Thrall's evocation of both a terrible crisis and the daily humiliations of life under occupation is nothing short of heartbreaking. From James Rebeggs, this brilliant and heartbreaking book is a masterpiece. It reads like a novel, yet is all sadly true. I finished it in tears. So he also, by the way, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2024 for general nonfiction. Mazel tov. And I'd say most importantly, just talk to people who've read the book and read it yourself. And so far, I've heard only rave reviews of it. So the plan today is to talk about the book, to whet your appetite to read it, but we'll also transition into discussing the currently grim situation, which extends not just to Gaza, not just to Lebanon, but to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel. We hope to encourage a more reflective and productive discussion than what we get out of, I'd say, our candidates running for president and other political offices. And most important, and something that's really rarely done in this country, is to humanize the people, particularly in Palestinian society. So before we begin the conversation, 2 items. First, I want to thank all the sponsors for this event. There's my department, Political Science, thanks to the Mann Public Foreign Affairs Fund. There's ISCOR, International Security and Conflict Resolution, Sociology, the Center for War and Society, Jewish Studies, History, the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs, the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, the Fred J. Hansen Peace Chair, the Study of Religion, the School of Journalism and Media Studies, the San Diego World Affairs Council, and the Cal Dean's Lecture Fund. Second, to put in a little bit of a plug, I'm part of a group of Jewish faculty, staff, and students at San Diego State looking to form an open-ended dialogue for those who feel connected for various reasons to the Jewish community, but are uncomfortable with the standard discussion on Israel, Palestine, and on Zionism that takes place in the heart of Jewish mainstream organizations. Some of us have found that top university officials, say here at San Diego State, don't quite know how to deal with us more critical Jews on Israel, and they end up marginalizing us. Also, many of us feel uncomfortable at the partisan nature of some of the October 7th memorials, something that there's not a place for those who don't want to be part of a partisan message. So feel free to come up to me after the event if you'd be interested in joining such a dialogue, or email me if you're interested. So with that said, we're now going to turn to our conversation part between myself and Nathan Thrall, and then there'll be time for questions and answers from the broader audience. This is being recorded. Okay.
It's on already.
Hello, testing. Can you hear me? Okay, good, good. All right, I've actually now read this book 3 times. I've marked it up considerably. Not this one. The other book I've also read multiple times, sorry. A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. Okay, read the other book too, by the way. We're not talking about today, but still an excellent book. Okay, so for those of you who haven't read it, the book's point of departure is a school bus crash on a poorly maintained road, which led to several deaths, including the 5-year-old Milad, who's the son of Abed Salama. So my first question to you is, why is this not simply a story about a tragic bus crash caused by the negligence of the driver of the semi-trailer that crashed into the bus on a rainy day?
Is this close enough? Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be with you. Should put this a little closer. This is a book that is really meant to give you a very visceral sense of what it is to actually be in this place in Palestine. And the societies that it depicts are highly, highly segregated. And it was important for me to tell a story that would tell the whole story of Israel-Palestine. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose to tell a story of a school bus crash, is that this was an event that brought Jews and Palestinians together, Jewish and Palestinian lives that have very little interaction with one another normally. And another reason that I really wanted to focus on something as commonplace as a bus accident, as a car accident, was that I was writing this book out of a sense of despair. I had been writing about this issue for many years, and I was watching as the Palestinian issue was slowly sinking in global priorities. There was a numbness to what was happening in Israel-Palestine, and you would see that there would be spikes of interest when there was a war in Gaza or some particular event, usually a violent event that would cause people to pay attention. Maybe you'd get some mobilization in Western capitals, and it would immediately disappear. And often what you would hear from politicians at that time is, we need to restore calm. This is terrible. There's a war in Gaza. There's terrible violence. We need to restore calm. And what I really wanted to do and the reason that I chose to tell about something as commonplace as a bus accident is that I wanted us to look at that situation of so-called calm and to see that it's anything but calm for Palestinians, and to draw our attention to the situation as it exists between those wars, which is one that we should be outraged by, that one that is filled with daily tragedies, many, many daily tragedies. And I wanted to choose just one to illustrate what actually everyday life is in this place. And for me, part of the book is doing many different things, but one of the things that it's doing is it's offering a critique of a system of ethnic domination by Israeli Jews over Palestinians. And the way that I think you can critique a system most effectively is to show how it works day in and day out. And if I were to choose something that's kind of a more natural subject for a journalist, like some invasion of a West Bank city center or a major bombing or a war in Gaza, those are things that people could dismiss as exceptions. They could say, well, that was the decision really of one bad commander. That was the decision of one prime minister at this particular geopolitical moment. And what I wanted to show is actually how the system works, independent of who is the commander, who is the prime minister. This system is in place no matter who the prime minister is. It's in place no matter who the commander in the West Bank or the commander overseeing Gaza is. And so that was why I really wanted to tell the story of ordinary lives that as they're navigating through this system. And I think another reason that that I chose to focus on something like a bus accident was that, you know, there have been so many reports written about apartheid. And this was something that had been entered, kind of really has become a near consensus in the international law and human rights communities. All the leading human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN Human Rights Council, Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, have found that Israel is practicing apartheid and have written very, very lengthy reports. Some of those reports can make your eyes glaze over. I mean, it's really, it is a complex and detailed system. And part of what I wanted to convey is how it actually works. And the way that I felt that I could do that most easily and also most deeply is to put you in the shoes of just a limited set of people as they're navigating through this system. And in this particular case, the story of a father searching for his son after his son's been involved in a bus accident, trying to navigate a system of segregated roads, of checkpoints, of a community that he lives in that's encircled by walls, and being unable to get through those checkpoints and get through those walls in order to find his son at one of the locations he's told, one of the hospitals that he's told his son might be at.
Okay. Yeah, you found a fascinating character in this Abed Salama. You know, I was just trying to think of qualities that I spotted in him based on your book. And he joined you on the initial book tour. He was a Marxist, right? He wanted to study, but wasn't able to study for higher education in the then Soviet Union. His opponent, an opponent of the dominant Fatah wing of the PLO, political prisoner in Israel, a failed romantic, married multiple times, didn't always treat his wives that well, and of course a survivor of much trauma, especially the death of his young child. I guess, can you tell us more just about, you know, what fascinated you about Abed Salama and you know, why this is just such a compelling character?
You know, I saw in Abed's story, really the story of the entire Palestinian story, and particularly the story of the occupation. He was born just after the occupation began. He graduated from high school just before the first Intifada broke out. He found himself an activist in the first Intifada, and then recruited by his brother-in-law into a left-wing faction, the DFLP. And then his brother-in-law was arrested, and he found himself at a very young age the local leader of the DFLP, and he himself was arrested along with many other young people around him, was tortured, sent to a prison, and experienced the first kind of the precursor of what became the permit system that controlled Palestinian lives. After he was released from prison, he was given a separate colored ID that prevented him from leaving his community, and he was trapped inside his community. He'd be beaten by soldiers if he tried to exit. And this was just before the Oslo Accords came into effect and the Palestinian Authority was established, and Abed was opposed to Oslo. He was opposed to it because he foresaw that this system that he was subjected to was only going to expand. The system of segregation, of permits, of confining Palestinians into small spaces. And in any event, I really found in Abed's story the entire Palestinian story. And he had said to me, actually, when he finished reading the book, you know, there's another character he said, her name's Nancy. He said her story is much more tragic than mine. You know, why did you choose me? Why did you put me at the center of the book? And part of the reason why is Nancy's much younger than Abed, and through Abed, I really felt that you could tell the whole Palestinian story, the story of the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the story of being a young political activist.
Good. I'm going to get back to Nancy later. I mean, that is a really gripping and very sad story with Nancy. I have a follow-up about Abed Salama. As we hear a lot more, rightfully so, about the horrors in Gaza, but life in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has also gotten considerably worse. If anything, that's even more consistent that the Israeli government wants to claim it and annex a big chunk of it. And so, what is his life now post October 7th? Has it just gotten just dramatically worse?
Yes. His life has, like everyone in the West Bank, his life has gotten dramatically worse in the last year. He and I were on book tour in the US together. We were planning to be here. This was last October. We were planning to be here and in the UK for 6 weeks. And what happened after October 7th is they immediately shut down his community. They trapped about 130,000 people in this walled enclave. Nobody could come or go. And all it took was 4 soldiers to do it, because there are 2 exits, and the whole West Bank is set up this way. Many of the roads to a given village are closed down, so you have only 1 or 2 exits, which makes it very easy for Israel to shut down a given community. And that's what happened here. This is a much bigger one, 130,000 people, part of them, many of them residents of Jerusalem, paying municipal taxes to Jerusalem, receiving almost no services. The Israeli state basically would only enter this community as a policing force with I mean, more of a gendarmerie than a police, and coming in with riot gear, and if they were coming to demolish a home or to arrest someone, but basically providing virtually no services, so much so that even emergency services would not go into this community without a police or army escort. And you know, just on the other side of this wall, you have very prosperous Jewish communities, Jewish settlements that are facing this walled ghetto and ignoring it. So immediately after October 7th, it took all of 4 soldiers to shut this place down. 2 at the checkpoint that leads into the rest of Jerusalem, 2 at the other end, put a concrete block in the middle of the road and put down a yellow gate, and that's it. 130,000 people are trapped. And that only lasted a little while, though that severe closure was relaxed, but the broader closures throughout the West Bank are as great as they've ever been. And it now takes hours to travel distances that a year ago took half an hour. You have over 600 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli settlers and the army in the last year. You have a huge increase in forced displacement. Just before, in September 2023, the United Nations issued a statement raising the alarm that there was a huge increase in forced displacement in the West Bank. Over 1,100 Palestinians had been forced off of their land in the preceding 18 months. And the UN was calling on the global community to do something about this. And just in the 6 weeks after October 7th, an even greater number of Palestinians was forcibly displaced. Israel has taken in the last year, it has confiscated more Palestinian land in the West Bank than in the previous 20 years combined. So what we have is a process of slow Israeli absorption, de facto annexation of the West Bank, and the expansion of Israeli Jewish settlements, the constriction of Palestinians into tighter and tighter communities. And this is a process that's been going on since 1967, but is in hyperdrive right now. So the other element is economically, everybody feels very constricted. Jobs in Israel and in the settlements are the largest employment sector for Palestinians in the West Bank. These are much higher paying jobs, and every extended family depends on them. They're so much higher paying, these jobs, that you have members of the Palestinian Authority security forces, which is also one of the better jobs that you can get in the West Bank, who are, captains and have, people working under their command who on their day off will go and work as day laborers inside Israel because the pay is so much greater than what they're making in a fairly senior position in the Palestinian Authority. So all of those jobs basically disappeared. Virtually all of those jobs disappeared after October 7th, and they haven't come back. And so those are the kind of general conditions that people are living in. And in addition, you have Israel is using much more lethal means in the West Bank than it had been. For the most part, over the last 15 years or so, Israel was doing drone strikes, helicopter strikes, airplane bombings in Gaza, but not in the West Bank. And now Israel is doing it with regularity in the West Bank, just recently dropping of quite a large bomb in Tulkarem. And so what we have is a real kind of convergence of Israeli practices in Gaza and Israeli practices in the West Bank. It used to be said that there was a Gaza model that was being applied to the West Bank. The Gaza model was, basically, there are a couple of exceptions to this, but for the most part, the Israeli policy is where there is a sparsely populated area, they try and settle it. Where there's a densely populated Palestinian area, they don't really have a hope of taking it over. And so they just wall it off or fence it off and control it from the outside. And this was what people referred to as the Gaza model. It's this dense area, we fence it off, we wall it off, we leave people trapped inside. And Anata, the community that Abed comes from, and the children and parents and teachers involved in this bus accident come from, that is a classic example of the Gaza model. They're literally encircled by walls. They have the 26-foot tall separation wall on 3 sides, and on a 4th side, a wall running through a segregated road, Route 4370, sometimes called the Apartheid Road, with Palestinian traffic on one side and Israeli traffic on the other. And now, in addition to this Gaza model being applied to the West Bank, we have the West Bank model being applied to Gaza. So Israel now has a corridor cutting northern Gaza from southern Gaza, splitting Gaza in half. It has a corridor at the bottom. It's controlling the northern tip as well. And you can imagine that they will create a couple more corridors, dividing Gaza into, let's say, 5 pieces. And they have this idea, which they talk about, of creating humanitarian bubbles, is what they call it, which is Palestinian population centers in between these Israeli-controlled corridors. And then Israel goes in and conducts raids in the Palestinian population centers, which is exactly the model in the West Bank.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions. One question is about the mother of Milad, Haifa, Abed's wife. I take it from the book she didn't want much attention. We don't learn as much about her, but would like what you're willing to share about just how in the years since the book came out, or at least since it happened in 2012, 2013, how has she come to terms with her son's death? And I guess the more general question this relates to is what's really fascinating about your book is it's not just about Palestinians being subjugated. Obviously, that is a big part of it, but you avoid any romanticization of the character. So it's not some kind of noble victim. So on one level, we see the Palestinians face 2 oppressors. They face the Israeli authorities, and they face the authoritarian and corrupt Palestinian Authority. And more broadly, we just see blemishes in the broader Palestinian community. We see family tensions, we see sexism, we see the story of Nancy, a mother of one of the dead children who's beaten and disowned by her husband and husband's family. So a really sad, tragic tale. And as I mentioned, even our hero Abed is not without his flaws in the way he's treated his ex-wives. And so, I both want to learn a little bit more about Haifa, but I also just am curious. You are telling these rich, nuanced stories that include blemishes and shortcomings within Palestinian society. How do you go about doing that? You're a relatively privileged outsider, but you obviously kept their trust, and it's much appreciated. But I imagine that whole thing is very a difficult terrain to navigate. So I just love to hear how you did this, where you did have to include shortcomings within Palestinian society.
Sure. So regarding Haifa, she is somebody who really has not wanted to talk about her grief or to talk about the accident, and she remains quite closed. It was an act of incredible generosity on her part that she allowed me to basically steal Abed and spend all of this time with him, and to have all these conversations in front of her and inside her home for years that she never had around her. I mean, part of why Abed opened up to me so much is because he was living in a kind of a cloud of silence, and no one around him wanted to talk about the accident, wanted to talk about his son for fear of upsetting him. But he yearned to talk about it, and he felt like he wasn't actually grieving properly because he was in this cloud of silence. And Haifa's approach to her grief it couldn't be more different. She didn't want to open up those wounds. And so I mean that remains the case today, and it's a huge difference between them. But she's been very, very warm to me and very supportive of this project. The blemishes, with both the Israeli and the Palestinian characters, I knew that I set out to write something that would read like a novel.
Yes.
And I wanted it to feel, I knew the project would succeed or fail based on how real these people felt. And so in order to create real people, they have to be three-dimensional human beings. We're all flawed and showing life in its fullness. And so I wasn't going to hide anything. I wasn't going to withhold anything. It's interesting because I have had two very, very different reactions to the fact that there are, as you say, these blemishes. And some have been from people who have said, look, couldn't you have just not included that Abed had at one point, two wives? There are so many, prejudices in Western society against Muslims, and like, couldn't you have just excluded that? And first of all, I'm not going to pander to those prejudices. They have their own way of structuring their society, and it's entirely legitimate. And I'm not going to come and impose, my view that this has to be hidden in some way. And the other reaction I got is the opposite, which was from Palestinians who said, "Thank you for treating us like normal human beings. I'm sick and tired of being painted as that. I always have to be painted as a perfect victim. The justness of the Palestinian cause, the demand for Palestinian liberty and freedom does not depend on our being perfect people." And there's something offensive in the fact that people are constantly portraying us as perfect victims. So two very, very different reactions, but regardless of those, I knew all along that for me, this was going to have to be a story that was rich and layered and showed life in its fullness.
Great. So the last question specifically on the book has to do with I think the conflicting nature of the Israeli-Palestinian interactions you depict in the book. There are times that are uplifting. We see moments of shared humanity among the Palestinians and Israelis, even with Jews in the nearby settlements of Adam. Yet your story near the end of the book, you have something about Israel's Channel 10 news segment is really chilling. I want to read just from a little bit of it.
It's gonna be in the other book.
Yes, right, sorry. Okay, so it's a reporter for Channel 10, Arik, who wanted to explore why Israeli youth might feel greater hatred than their elders. He believed the story would hold up a mirror to Israeli society. So it was about what they thought about the bus crash. So he went to a high school in the coastal town of Hadera, halfway between Haifa and Tel Aviv. Arik interviewed a few of the students who had posted comments under their own names. The segment showed him reading a post to the boy who had written it. Those little Palestinians could be the terrorist attacks of the future. Don't give me that bullshit that everyone's a human being. They're whores, not people, and they deserve to die. The camera zooms in on the face of the boy who looks secular and athletic and is wearing a Hollister t-shirt under an unzipped hoodie. You wrote this? Arik began to ask. From the heart, the boy says. He is standing in front of a basketball court while younger preteens are playing behind him. Arik asked whether the boy really meant what he said. We're talking about 4 to 5-year-olds, yes? Little kids. So what? So, yeah, this gets to a really heartbreaking ending, and we kind of think about sentiments being expressed now. This may be a tough question, but from this book, what is the ultimate takeaway on just where Israeli-Palestinian relations are going? I think that is a big part of the book.
So, I mean, I don't know if it's the ultimate takeaway, but it is the end of the book describes this TV special that was made on Israeli TV, not about the accident itself, but the Israeli reaction to it. And it's not all of Israeli society, it's a subset of Israeli society, but it was nevertheless disturbing enough to this TV anchor that he created a whole TV feature on the reactions of young Israelis. And what he was most shocked by about their celebration of the deaths of these kindergartners was that they did it without pseudonyms, that they did it openly under their own names on their own Facebook pages, under their real names on the comments sections of news sites. And obviously this speaks to an extraordinary degree of dehumanization. And this is, I wrote this book before October 7th, but we have seen dehumanization on steroids over the past year, and this subset of Israeli society from 2012 has grown greatly in strength, and now we have a center-left president of Israel who was saying in effect that there are no innocents in Gaza, and that kind of a discourse is very, very widespread today. So if you ask me, where things are going, I think that there is a real kind of eliminationist logic that prevails today, a feeling that it's about all the land of Palestine and it's us or them. And in terms of the real takeaway from the book, I think the real takeaway from the book for me is really about the human cost of this terrible system that we're supporting, that we, the U.S., are supporting, and how deeply it reaches into the lives of every Palestinian subjected to it, and how it reaches even to the point of affecting, who Abed chooses as a marriage partner and what point in his life he and his co-workers are at risk of losing their jobs in Jerusalem unless they get the right color ID, which they could only get by marrying someone who had the right color ID. And they actually go and seek out marriage partners based on the color of the ID. And that's just one example of how deeply this system penetrates into the most intimate aspects of people's lives. So I really I think the real takeaway is a visceral sense of what it really is to live under this system.
Thank you. Your book overall has gotten an enthusiastic reception. Obviously, you won the Pulitzer Prize. Yet you are dealing with a very sensitive topic, all the more sensitive in the post-October 7th era, where what people say and comment is constantly under scrutiny, and there's very polarizing reactions. And yeah, you do have very clear views. Some of them are quite cutting. So, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to call you sort of, quote, neutral, unquote. You have a very strong point of view. It's not polemical, but you have a very strong viewpoint. And so I know you've gotten some pushback when presenting this book, and even before the book we talked about earlier, some pushback. But hear about the book, and you just maybe give some highlights of some elements, the disinviting when you did your tour in the U.S. and elsewhere, including Germany.
So the book was published on October 3rd of last year, and obviously our whole tour was turned upside down, and about 25% of the venues that were going to host me and Abed together canceled. And in general, the whole atmosphere around basically talking about Palestinian life under occupation became much more difficult. And even in some places, In some places, it was the people who initially invited us who canceled on their own. And these are obviously not, right-wing organizations. These are organizations that consider themselves progressive and liberal, who in the first place wanted to talk about Palestinian life under occupation and said, now we can't do it. And in other cases, it was, the UK police. We had the biggest event of our tour was at a big hall in London called Conway Hall, and people bought tickets, and it was 400 seats, and the UK police shut it down. And they were not just targeting us specifically, it was anything that had Palestine in the title was shut down that week. The night before, there was traditional music that was going to be played at a church in London. They shut traditional Palestinian music. That event was shut down. Ads on the radio were pulled for the book, and radio ads in the US, they have very strict rules, at least for books. You cannot use superlatives, even if you've gotten wonderful pre-publication reviews, brilliant, whatever. You cannot say, you cannot say brilliant, or you cannot say Publishers Weekly called it brilliant. You literally basically can give the title of the book, and there's nothing offensive about the title of this book. But due to listener complaints, the ads for the book were pulled from radio stations in the US. And to this day, actually, my publisher cannot advertise the book on Amazon because Amazon says that they don't allow political ads for books that they deem political. But, just the other week, I went and looked on my Amazon page for the book, and there was an ad for some book about Israel, with Israel in the title, a much more political title, running on my the page for this book. So it's not unique to me. It's something just last week we saw, or very recently we saw, that there was a faculty member from, I think it was San Francisco State, who was going to speak at Wake Forest.
Oh, yes.
And her event was canceled. And when we see it all the time. I was just supposed to speak at a school in Detroit, and they couldn't have me there, so I spoke at the Detroit Public Library instead.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm proud to say I have a common bond with you. For my book, it was canceled at a few places last minute in London. And also, like you, I guess I've written things on Israel, Palestine that my mother did not approve of. I saw an interview with you where your mother doesn't read your stuff, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes. So, all right. Moving from that light note, going to the situation in Gaza. So our leading politicians, including Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate, Tim Walz, they will repeatedly say today's situation began with the Hamas-led massacres of Israelis and non-Israelis on October 7th. So what's wrong with that message? What should we understand about Israel's long control and siege of Gaza and of Gazan society that long predates October 7th?
Well, I think one of the most important things to know is that obviously history didn't begin on October 7th. Obviously, there's been decades and decades of dispossession and subjugation. But Gaza itself, prior to the siege, there were restrictions placed on Gaza dating back to the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. The fence that went up around Gaza to fence off Gaza, this is more than a decade before Hamas came to power in Gaza, went up in the early 1990s. A separate permit system for Gazans started in the early 1990s. So the general Israeli policy of closing off Gaza is one that's been in place for decades. So I think that's one of the most basic things I would say. And I also would say, since you bring up Harris and we're coming up on the election, I really feel like she's been let off the hook. That everybody has said they hear a different tone, but she's affirming over and over again that she fully supports Biden's policies, and there's every indication that she will do the exact same thing.
Okay, this is perhaps an awkward question. I'll preface it by acknowledging that, yes, there's a profound power imbalance between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. I don't mean to equate their situation. We know that Israelis hold most of the cards, carry out the bulk of the atrocities, while Palestinians bear the brunt of the suffering. Still, there's also the troubling reality that violent racist sentiments toward the other, ultimately self-destructive, have gained a strong foothold both in Israel and across the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem. So I'm thinking in this context where Israel can carry out crimes against humanity, killing tens of thousands of people, destroying the infrastructure, bringing famine conditions, while Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad can massacre hundreds of Israeli civilians in a single day. Help us understand what would otherwise, I guess, be ordinary, even decent Israelis and Palestinians can dehumanize the other, celebrate their suffering, again, without comparing the two, but still that bottom line seems we're in that situation where this hate that can celebrate killing of others is prominent, I'd say, in both societies. And so let me just get your thoughts.
On how we got to this point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm looking for some of your profound wisdom on what is it that, look, that can lead Israelis or otherwise decent to really kind of support these views. Policies that are horrifying. And also, I think for Palestinians, the idea that there was something favorable, positive about the massacre of Israelis on October 7th.
Well, as I was saying, I think that it is the case that today, majorities on both sides see that this is a fight over all the land. This isn't about the West Bank and Gaza. This is about Palestine. And have this feeling that it's us or them. And how, each side can feel that way. I mean, on the Israeli side, the longevity of this system of domination, part of it depends on Israelis being able to live very, very comfortable lives where they can easily ignore the occupation that is not only right next to them, but they're serving, that they served in when they were in the army or when they're in reserve, or that their kids are serving in and coming for dinner on Friday nights. It's just very, very easy to live a comfortable life as an Israeli and to not think about the domination over Palestinians in any way, and that is a key to the longevity and success of this system. Today, if you're in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you wouldn't know that there is a war happening 45 minutes away in Gaza, or that there's a war in Lebanon. Kids are in school, cafes are full, streets are filled. You wouldn't have any sense of it. For Palestinians, I think it's you don't need to explain it in terms of being able to ignore. They can't ignore the domination that they face every minute. But what you can talk about, and I've been asked this a lot, is, why is there support for violent resistance? And I think the answer to that is very, very simple. And that is that, you know, if you look at the alternative to violent resistance, which is largely speaking, what we're talking about is the Palestinian Authority and the factions that are a part of it, and the general strategy of the leaders of the national movement right now. Their general strategy was to agree through the Oslo Accords to have limited autonomy in parts of the West Bank and in Gaza. And if we look territorially at Palestine, there's a single sovereign, Israel, from the river to the sea. And you have Palestinian limited autonomy in about 10% of that territory. Now, again, it's limited. Israel enters these areas at will. It makes arrests, but it's 10%. It's 165 little islands of Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank, and it's Gaza. And that combined is 10%. So the rest is directly administered by Israel. And of course, all of it is controlled by Israel. And the idea of the Palestinian Authority was, we're going to agree to this system that we don't really like, on the grounds that it's only going to last for 5 years. It was supposed to end after 5 years, that Israelis and Palestinians would negotiate some permanent arrangement at the end of it. The word state was never offered because Israel wasn't prepared to give Palestinians a state and said explicitly that they were opposed to it. But some kind of permanent arrangement. And that we are going to go, you know, the Palestinian Authority was born out of the first Intifada. There was an uprising. Palestinians made the territory ungovernable for Israel. And Israel had to think, how are we going to continue to control all this territory, given how many more resources we now need to expend in order to do it, and our public image is declining, et cetera, et cetera. And so out of that came the idea of giving Palestinians limited autonomy. This was a means of squashing the Intifada, and the defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, who became the prime minister, is on record having shifted his thinking as a result of this uprising. Now, the people, the leaders of that uprising, which was an uprising largely of Palestinian youth throwing stones against Israeli soldiers with M16s and tanks, the leaders of that uprising suddenly found themselves members of the Palestinian Authority, and in many cases, their security forces. So they go overnight from fighting against Israel to working hand in glove with Israel to arrest their own brothers and cousins and sons. And not just violent resistance to Israel, they're arresting any resistance, including nonviolent resistance to Israel. And they're doing it under the theory that at the end of 5 years of doing this, the whole world's going to say, look how peaceful they are, look how great they've been at providing security to Israel, we're going to give them a state. And here we are 30 years later, and they have no state. They have no glimmer of a state on the horizon, and they don't have a different strategy. It's the same strategy. It's, we're going to, you know, cross every T, dot every I. We're going to do what the World Bank and the IMF tell us we need to do to be ready for statehood. They've been declared ready for statehood by both of those organizations. They have been providing Israel full security in the West Bank. They are working hand in glove with Israel. Israel's had a very quiet period in the West Bank since the current president was elected in 2005. And there's no state coming. And so if that is the alternative to violent resistance, is essentially your leaders being a key pillar of indefinite subjugation, then of course people are going to support violent resistance. And it doesn't matter if it's called Hamas or something else.
Okay, I have a few final open-ended and interrelated questions about hope and constructive discussion on the situation on college campuses. So we can sort of see tons of reasons for despair. One of the things just brought up is just the nature of the Israeli system, but also of formal Palestinian politics in Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem. But there are hopeful elements, I believe, and so I'm curious just what you think of. What are the hopeful signs among Israelis and Palestinians, for Palestinians, wherever they may be, in the occupied territories, in the diaspora? I guess I'm also curious, just because of my identity, what are the hopeful signs among the other large Jewish community in the globe, the Jews in the United States? So can you help, can you give us something? The formal politics really gives us no hope. I think it's true in the US also, but what are the hopeful areas? That's, those of us who really want to bring about something very different. What can we take hope in?
I think the number one thing that we can take hope in is precisely what you started your question with, which was these student protests that we saw, that this major shift in global public opinion. And that is a long-term hope, because those students aren't gonna hold political power tomorrow, but they will in 20 years. And I think that, if we're speaking realistically, this situation is going to last much longer than that. And so the kind of hope that I have is a very, very long-term hope. In the short term, the medium term, I'm very pessimistic. As I said, more land was confiscated this year than in the past 20 years combined in the West Bank. And so everything is moving toward total Israeli victory, total Israeli absorption of the West Bank, total constriction of Palestinians into small ghettos. And if we project outward from that, the fate of the Palestinians is going to look like the fate of the Native Americans. If you just continue linearly on that path, that will be the outcome. And the only countervailing force is the baby steps that we're seeing today toward accountability. We're seeing baby steps from the ICC, from the ICJ, from European states that are saying that they are not going to send arms to Israel, from a different kind of, at least, there's no chance that the US Senate is going to pass it, but at least a couple of senators who are talking about cutting off arms to Israel. So that process for the first time, sanctions being imposed again on a small group of settlers and settler entities. That's something that can be amplified. Again, these are baby steps. It's a decades-long road, but those are steps in the right direction, and they do offer some kind of hope. And an even bigger hope, I think, is this shift in public opinion. We saw a poll, we've seen several polls that say a majority of Americans are opposed to sending arms to Israel. So our politics is totally at odds with that reality. Like, it's not half of our politicians who are talking about that. It isn't half the, senior people in the Biden administration who are pushing for that. So there's a huge, huge disconnect. And I think that I derive hope from the fact that disconnect, I hope, won't be sustained.
Okay, and just a follow-up about particularly American universities, given the crucial importance of the United States to what's going on over there, is, the student protests have been very exciting and inspiring, but can you say more about what do we want? Let's say, what do we want from professors? What do we want from top administrators? We're getting some stuff about just tightening supposed time, place, and manner restrictions. Seemingly, it's just making it harder to have robust speech and discussion. Yet we do know the good news seems to be there is still a lot of far-reaching discussion, You know, if you think of the one sector, I think of American society where there's really cutting edge, critical, serious discussion. I think it happens on the universities. So do you have any thoughts on, are you hopeful about that? Is that going well? Or are you more concerned about the negative trends from the politicians trying to clamp down on expression here?
Well, I mean, I'm disconcerted by the fact that the protests are much smaller now than they were last spring.
Sure.
That these efforts at clamping down on them have succeeded to some extent. And if there's ever a moment for them to be as large as possible, it's in the weeks preceding the election. If you're going to get any kind of concessions, it's now. They were paying attention when those protests were happening last spring. And those protests and the general atmosphere was a big part of why you got the sanctions on Israeli settlers for the first time ever from the Biden administration. So it's not a fair trade-off. We're going to support the annihilation of Gaza with one hand, and on the other hand, here's a few sanctions for a small group of Israeli settlers, when it's, of course, the Israeli state that is actually responsible. But the point is that they were listening, and that you can get achievements from having these large crowds, and so I think what I take away is just how frightened they were, how you saw how quickly, what a concerted effort there was to crush this. And I think that is reflective of how much they fear the fact that young people are talking and thinking about this differently. And therefore, the future of US policy on this issue is going to be different.
Okay, we're now ready for question and answer. Let's see, is Noah here? Or sorry, I want a little bit of help in handing out the microphone. My plan is, thank you, Noah. These will be presumably directed at Nathan Thrall. We'll probably get about 3 questions, take 3 questions at once. And then Nathan can kind of gauge how to connect them, what parts to answer. And so thank you to Noah for that. Raise your hand.
Hello. I'd like to ask a question about because of the upcoming U.S. election for 2024 presidential election. I want to ask, do you see differences in policy about Israel and Palestine and the current greater Middle East in terms of the Harris versus Trump presidential election? Whoever will be elected, do you see a shift in policy with either one? And do you think can you summarize what the differences are of policy between the 2 major candidates on this issue?
Okay, and let's get 2 more. Yes.
Hello, thank you for coming in. So you mentioned about how the West Bank model is being practiced in Gaza. What's the end goal of the Israeli government? Is it the complete taking of more Palestinian land and potentially even other Arab countries? I remember seeing the party of Ben Gvir having the picture of both historical Palestine and virtually all of Jordan. I don't want to have my question be too broad, since we can talk about this for a long time, but shouldn't the neighboring Arab countries be also worried about the Israeli actions? Thank you.
So a couple times in your book where you bring up another element of inequality and segregation in Israel, and that's between the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi Jews. I was wondering if there's a takeaway that we should take from that, and what does that inform us about the inequality between Palestine and Israeli Arabs, or Israeli Jews? Thank you.
Let's start with these three, and then we'll do another round of three. I don't want, I don't want Nate to have too many things to keep in his head.
On Trump versus Harris, I would say that obviously Trump's views are not very coherent, and he says different things. And you know, he claims to be very anti-war. That's one of the things that he says. But I think broadly speaking, you know, his advisors want Israel are ready for Israel to annex all of the territory and to have perpetual apartheid. And David Friedman is former ambassador, had to U.S. ambassador to Israel, is very close to Trump, was very influential in the last administration, and he's spoken about this publicly and openly. I think he calls it like the one Jewish state project, and so I think that what you would see from Trump is a green light for annexation and potentially even efforts at pushing Palestinians out. Now, Harris, we see, is fully supportive of the Biden policy, and she says so explicitly. So it's really, you know, choosing between the plague and cancer here. And so I think that what I would say is we can be clear-eyed about the fact that probably Trump would authorize even worse Israeli behavior, and therefore it would be worse for Palestinians. However, if it were the case that Harris were to lose and it were widely understood that she had lost because of Gaza, that would have very large long-term implications in the United States, and potentially very positive ones. So you have to weigh those two things, but that is also a very big if, because it's very possible that she would lose and it wouldn't be seen that it was over Gaza. Even if it really was over Gaza, there'll be a big effort to deny that fact. So if that could be, if she could lose and it could be over Gaza, then I think that would send a really strong message. We've never had a president lose over being too opposed to Palestinian rights. And you see that part of AIPAC's power is that they're able to take out a single congressperson, and it's not that many that they've done this to. This election cycle, they did it to two, or two very prominent ones. But that message, it lasts for decades. Politicians live in fear of it. And so if you had an actual presidential candidate who lost over this issue and lost because they were too strongly opposed to Palestinian rights, it would send a very strong message for Democratic politicians for generations to come. Yes. It could. It's a question whether Michigan would be the decisive state, but yes, absolutely. The end goal of the Israeli government, I mean, you know, for sure, Israel would like to have all of Gaza and the West Bank. And there are, as you mentioned, there are people in the Israeli government who'd like to have parts of Jordan, parts of Lebanon. But it's really the takeover of all of Gaza and the West Bank that I think should concern us more. It's a more realistic goal for them. And it's possible, you know, now with southern Lebanon that they would stay for quite some time. So I think that, you know, the thing is that Israel really doesn't think that it could get away with huge expulsion unless there was a big regional war or some kind of distracting event that would allow for it. They haven't pushed Gazans into Sinai. They fear that they would lose the peace treaty with Egypt. Jordan would resist very strongly if Israel tried to push Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan. But these are not impossible things. And it's something that we should be very alert to. I'm glad you brought up the Mizrahi discrimination. You know, this was the discrimination against Jews from Arab countries and more broadly from the Middle East and North Africa was severe, and you know what it really was it was part of anti-Arab racism, and this particular character in the book, his parents and he himself, felt it severely. And what we have is a lot of the Mizrahim today are some of the most right-wing people in Israel. And I think that some part of that is about proving your loyalty and proving how far you are from the Arab that you are being seen as, or that your parents were seen as.
All right, I want to actually get in a couple of questions from the patients, live streamers. One person, anonymous, does this presenter feel any outright rage toward the Hamas for their horrific behavior towards their Jewish neighbors on October 7th, 2023? Many of those neighbors had given these individuals higher paying jobs and treating them on friendly terms. Most of the deteriorating events following that October 7th atrocities might be seen as a natural sequela following the initiation of war. This question will likely not be asked based on the apparent anti-Israel prejudice I see in the presentation. So the question is being asked, and so go ahead.
Do you want me to take several? Yeah.
No, well,
okay.
Yes, take several. Okay, all right, that's the related one. Okay, good. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hi, good evening, Nathan. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for organizing this. Thank you. In relation to the online question, I'm interested in the way anti-Semitism is being conceptualized in terms of a conflation of the state, a conflation of a critique of the state of Israel, a critique of maybe mainstream Zionism. Maybe Jonathan can help with the terminology, all the different kinds of Zionism out there. But the critique of Zionism, the critique of Israel as being conflated with anti-Semitism or understood as anti-Semitic, and maybe specifically the move from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance with promoting different kinds of bills in Congress to criminalize critique of Israel and Zionism, or question Israeli policy as anti-Semitic.
Yeah, those are good interconnections. I mean, so the upset anonymous questioner, he does, I mean, this is sort of part of the issue, wants to hear much more about, well, what about what Hamas did? And why isn't that getting far more attention? And so in some ways, it's kind of following up on my question, but in a much harsher, I guess, challenging way. And then Rebecca's question is, all right, then we got these really sensitive issues. We certainly know that for a chunk of the American Jewish community, when you're attacking Zionism, which seems so central to many American Jews, that is sensitive, and so they want a definition that reflects that. So, you know, how do you deal with, I guess, the frustration felt by a number of partisan Jews who identify very closely with Israel. And to them, it is about anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So regarding the first question, Hamas clearly committed war crimes on October 7th. There's no question about it. And Israel has committed many war crimes before October 7th and since October 7th. And so I think the question was whether I had horror at the war crimes that were committed on October 7th. And yes, I'm horrified by them. But I also believe that so long as there is a system of subjugation over people based on their inborn characteristics, there will be resistance to it. There will be violent resistance to it. And so those who are supportive of that system in one way or another, tacitly or explicitly, bears responsibility for the fact that there is going to be more and more violence in response to it. The question about anti-Semitism and the IHRA. So, you know, the definition of, for me, the definition of anti-Semitism is very simple. It's hatred of Jews, it's prejudice against Jews. And the IHRA definition is an attempt that was crafted by pro-Israel organizations to silence speech that's critical of Israel, to expand the definition of anti-Semitism and smuggle in these examples that have nothing to do with hatred of Jews, have nothing to do with prejudice against Jews, and that are purely about criticism of Israel. And so for me, the IHRA definition is an awful definition of anti-Semitism that we should all oppose. And it is being used very effectively to get by, to basically, you know, we live in societies that have protections for free speech. And we carve out a couple of exceptions where we say you actually don't have hate speech, you don't have free speech in this category, and that's hate speech. So it's an attempt to try and define the speech that they don't like as hate speech when it's not hate speech. And it's a means of getting around our normal free speech protections. And I think that that we ought to resist it. You know, the core of the IHRA definition, they talk about the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. And to just give you a sense of how overly broad this definition is and how subject it is to abuse, you know, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army on Holocaust Remembrance Day of all days, in uniform, as he's the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army a number of years ago, gave a speech where he talked about how the winds of fascism were blowing in Israel, and it reminded him of the atmosphere in Germany in the 1930s. Now, the IHRA definition, it explicitly says any comparison to Nazi Germany is anti-Semitism. I know you see comparisons to Nazi Germany in the Israeli press every day, but we are adopting a definition that would put the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army in violation of it. He's an anti-Semite. Now, it's clearly too broad a definition if the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army is an anti-Semite under it. You know, another example is related to double standards. There's the leading organization of British Jewry. It's called the Board of Deputies. They several years ago, Israel was passing a law called the nation state law that was solidifying discrimination that already existed against Palestinian citizens of Israel. And many Jews in the world, including very pro-Israel Jews, were opposed to this law. And there was a senior executive in the board of deputies who spoke out against it, wrote against it, and there was a hearing against her by the board of deputies to fire her, and she was in fact dismissed because she's in violation of the IHRA definition for criticizing this law that very mainstream and pro-Israel forces in the US and elsewhere in the diaspora were opposed to. Why? Because it's a double standard. Why was she criticizing this equivalent of a constitutional change in Israel, and she wasn't criticizing, constitutional reforms or other kinds of discriminatory laws in other countries? It's a double standard, which again is an absurd way of defining anti-Semitism. We all choose our issues. We can't all be educated and invested in everything. And we have very good reasons to care more about the country that we are spending billions of dollars to arm as it's committing war crimes. And so it's absurd, this notion that it's anti-Semitic to focus on where our money is actually being spent.
Don't forget that side of the room. Sorry to make you walk.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this. It's really wonderful. I'm someone who's Jewish and also white, and over the past year have found myself in a number of mind-numbing and heartbreaking conversations with people who share my identities, in which I feel like I'm trying to explain that someone who's Palestinian is just as human as someone who is white and Jewish. And I'm so grateful for your book, because it seems like something I can hand to people who might, be a little flexible, and yeah, be like, read this, and hopefully this will teach you that Palestinians are humans. And yet that's not something that I always have access to, obviously. So yeah, I'm curious from your own personal experience, what are some ways in which you found it possible to move the needle on people's understanding of humanity in this issue?
Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Dave Edick. I'm president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. So under the guise of polarized politics in the United States, there's actually a great deal of fragmentation and reorientation going on, I would say. Many on the right are happy to see crackdowns against students on universities, yet in the next breath are opposed to weapon sales to Israel in the pursuit of another war. There's actually a great deal of resistance on the right to more war. And I'm wondering if you have any comment about that.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I think most of us are fully convinced of the power of the AIPAC lobby, but I have been wondering in the last few months about something that may be more hidden, which is just is part of the reason this situation is so immovable, because of the global military industrial complex lobby and all of the other regimes around the world that are getting technology that has been fully tested on Palestinians, because we had a captive population we could test it on in Israel. And I'm just wondering how much we even know about that influence on, on the fact that not 50% of our politicians are opposed to selling arms to Israel, right? On why the American public's perspective is so wildly different than what our politicians are doing.
So I'll take those three. Thank you for your kind words about the book. You know, I don't have a kind of an anecdote that you could give, or you know, some kind of quick tip on how to convince people that Palestinians are human. I think that one of the things that's very valuable is to bring them into contact with Palestinians, to let them talk to Palestinians. I think if I think about how many people who have moved over the years from a position like the one you've described encountering to seeing Palestinians as human, I think that a lot of that, many stories I know are about actually Palestinians who were extraordinarily patient and generous and, you know, almost superhuman in their patience and generosity, and willing to listen and let somebody work through that kind of prejudice. And so I would just encourage you to the extent that that's possible, to bring them into contact with Palestinians who they can talk to and see for themselves. I'm not sure that I understood exactly the question about the inconsistency. It was that on the right you have people who are both against war, against supporting Israel in expanding this war and now potentially war with Iran on one hand, and on the other hand, they're in favor of crushing anti-war protests on campuses. Is that right? Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have really any you know keen insight into that. I think that you're right to point out the inconsistency there, and I think that you know the partisan politics of it is trumping, so to speak, the clear anti-war sentiment that these people have. I'm sorry, I don't have the greater insight into it. The question about the global industrial military complex, you know, I think that it's certainly the case that there are many interests that are behind the U.S. support for Israel, and that is clearly the interests of major employers, arms manufacturers. It is a part of it, for sure. I also think a big part of it is what you started your question with, which is that on this issue, there is organized political money on one side. There's really almost nothing on the other side. And if you take almost any other issue in the United States, you have interest groups on both sides. And here it's really, you know, it's not just not an even playing field. There's just really no one on the other side of it.
Yeah, I want to add to the mix. So this will be the first question, and two more. Preeti Joshi asks, you referenced the fate of Native peoples in the U.S. as a parallel to what might happen to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Increasingly, we're hearing that to speak of Israel as a, quote, settler colonial state, unquote, is inaccurate, if not anti-Semitic. Could you speak to that, please? So that'll be one, two more.
I just want to reiterate the appreciation. So thank you for being here. My question is, it's obvious the tensions that exist in Palestine and Israel are incredibly high, especially after October 7th. You talk about the creation of a Palestinian state and that being the long-term goal. So I guess my question is, could a Palestinian state and Israel exist or coexist peacefully?
More thanks, Nathan, for coming, and Jonathan for persisting for 10 years to get him here. I have a very simple question. It occurred to me that it might be very helpful for framing this discussion about October 7th to recognize it as simply a counterattack rather than as something out of the blue.
Thank you. So the question was about, is it anti-Semitic to talk about Israel as a settler colonial state? Obviously not. I mean, the Zionist movement in its early decades used the word colonial to speak of itself very openly. There was something called the Palestine Colonization Association that was buying land in Palestine. This is not a secret. You can read leading, Zionist thinkers and politicians who are speaking very openly about this being a project of colonization. You could take a classic essay that I would recommend to all of you, is a very short, really not that much longer than kind of the long op-eds that run in the Times these days, by Vladimir Jabotinsky, called The Iron Wall. It is maybe one of the greatest essays ever written on Israel-Palestine. That now he's a right-winger and he is the father of today's, Likud. But the views that he is expressing are deep, deep truths about what the Zionist movement was doing at the time. He wrote it in the early 1920s. It's a superb essay which speaks very openly about colonization. So there's, unless you want to call the leaders of the Zionist movement anti-Semites, it makes no sense. There's also a superb book from actually before the occupation began. It was published or written just before the occupation began by a Jewish historian named Maxim Rodinson. It's a tiny little essay. It's called Israel, a colonial, no, yeah, I forget, he uses the reverse order than people use today. Israel, a colonial settler state. And the English edition has a question mark. He's a French historian, the French one does not. And it is basically a long essay that you could read in an afternoon. I taught a class at Bard College 2 years ago. I signed it. That's what the students loved more than anything else. It is extremely good. It's one of the best things ever written on Israel-Palestine. And again, he's talking about colonization before even the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began, and he's using quotes from many, many Israeli officials. Could a Palestinian state exist peacefully alongside Israel? In theory, absolutely. In reality, as I say, we're moving exactly in the opposite direction. We're moving toward a total Israeli takeover of the West Bank, the expansion of Israeli Jewish settlements, and the constriction of Palestinians into tighter and tighter enclaves. So, there is a theoretical possibility that you could have a Palestinian state, but all of the politics and the facts on the ground have been moving in the opposite direction, and it seems extremely unlikely in the near to medium term. And that's been the case for quite a long time. That's not just over the last year. I think that the last one was really more of a comment than a question. It was about framing October 7th as a counterattack. I mean, you can talk about many of the Hamas rockets that are fired out of Gaza, many of the attempts that they've made over the years to break out of the siege, to overturn the status quo. Of course, the violence is being imposed on them daily, and there's no doubt about that.
You okay with that? 10?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So our plans, we'll go for about 10 more minutes. There are still books for sale, and so you'll still have a chance if you buy it at 8:50 to get Nathan Thrall to autograph it. Okay, so take a few more.
Thank you for being here. The United States, Canada, Great Britain find themselves in a very small minority among the global nations regarding Israel's actions. I'm curious, why doesn't the apartheid experience in South Africa inform this country's position? It took us a long time to get there, get on the right side there as well. And I'm curious why I don't hear, it doesn't seem to resonate at all. And that's rather recent history. What are your opinions on that?
There are really amazing videos of Biden speaking about apartheid in South Africa in the 80s. And, you know, it should be said that it took a very long time for the United States to come around to opposing apartheid in South Africa. And I hope that we're at the beginning of the U.S. coming around on apartheid in Israel-Palestine. But obviously, as I say, with the previous question, there isn't an even playing field. There is the power, you know, the gatekeepers, the powers that be, the leading politicians who, no matter who's president next, none of them are going to be talking about apartheid or opposing it. They're going to continue supporting it. That has been the U.S. Policy. And part of that is because of what a distorted picture we're given of the reality in Israel-Palestine in the mainstream press. And again, that's beginning to change as well. But I think that a lot of it is people are told the kind of default position, the kind of default story that people are told is one that makes a false equivalence between the subjugator and the subjugated. And that's how so much of the press talks about this place, talks about Israel-Palestine. And I see that that's beginning to change, but until that changes, then of course many people are going to continue to resist that description. What was the was there a second one after that?
No, you jumped to answer the first one before we look.
Okay.
Oh, that's what, yeah.
Hello, this is kind of going off a previous question, but based on your experience in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and going back to the news segment response, do you believe that there's an effective method to rehumanizing a group of indoctrinated youth and tying this to on-campus protests since groups are so polarized? Thank you.
Someone asking a question recently mentioned that the US, the UK, and Canada normally count among Israel's, biggest supporters, but we've recently seen President Macron in France advocate for a weapons embargo. Keir Starmer's government in the UK halted existing weapons shipments, and Canada have been weighing that as well. Do you think Israel is currently on the path to becoming a sort of pariah state?
Just as a quick preface, I am not Jewish, but I've been really disheartened by how quickly Jewish friends and colleagues who have a broader or more, reflective perspective on the issue were called self-hating Jews, this awful phrase, self-hating Jews, in the last year. And I'm wondering, has your book found a reception in Israel itself? Is there readership there? Was it published there? Is it reviewed there? Have you found what has been the purchase and how are you perceived as an American interloper? How are you understood within this conversation yourself?
So I'll take those three. So I just want to make sure I understood the first one about rehumanizing indoctrinated youth. Can you elaborate? What?
And reflecting on that, if you think there's like an effective method, because I've heard of like peacemaking workshops and building empathy, but those are only short term, like effective short term. So with your experience.
Got it. So the question for those who couldn't hear was about that I had done reporting among both Jews and Palestinians, and what do I think about efforts to kind of bring them together and to humanize, for them to have peace building workshops and to humanize one another. In general, I'm not opposed to those things, but I'm very skeptical about their efficacy, actually, because often the framing around them is as though, you know, the real problem isn't structural, that it isn't a structural, a system of ethnic domination by one group over another, but it's actually a lack of understanding. And so if they only were to sit together and like hear one another, and I'm a human and you're a human, then it would disappear. But actually there are real interests. You know, people are going to lose. Some people are going to lose when a system of domination collapses. And so what I think can be counterproductive is when a message is sent that it's simply a matter of misunderstanding one another, and ignoring that there actually is a system of control with real interests behind it. So I think, you know, that there can be positive aspects to them, but it's also important how they're done. The other question was whether Israel is on the path to becoming a pariah state. You know, as I say, baby steps. We're seeing inching along on that road, but we also have to remember that, you know, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman just lost their jobs. Israel wasn't even their main issue. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are both going to be full supporters of Israel as it continues to expand in the West Bank, as it stays in Gaza. So, you know, the reality is it's a very long road, but I do think, yes, we are moving in that direction. The readership in Israel, couldn't read my own handwriting. So I have not had, the book hasn't come out in Hebrew yet. And there's a translator who's working on it. And for the most part, it hasn't really, it doesn't exist so much in Israel. It's just a handful of bookstores that have it. There's been one review in the Hebrew press, which was actually one of the most insightful, the deepest reviews I received of the book, and I loved that review. And I think I actually found a Hebrew publisher finally as a result of that review. So I've had very positive individual reactions from Israelis, but I can't really say what the reaction is in Israel in this general way until the book comes out in Hebrew. Yeah.
All right, let's say one or two more questions, and that will really be it. It's getting late.
Yeah, thank you so much for your book. The amount of knowledge I gained was immense. And I was lucky I was on a long flight and literally read it in one sitting. It's that easy of a read, so thank you. My question is, would love to hear your recommendation on news sources because what we get is very biased and one-sided. So would love to hear your input on that.
And then one last question. Noah, you have the difficult task of choosing a personal being part. I wash my hands of it.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Professor. I have to say, yeah, I agree with most of what you said so far, but I did find what you said about Trump to be disturbing, to teach a lesson insofar as Harris losing the election, because, Trump has said, we should attack Iran, he tried to go to war with Mexico in his last presidency. He doesn't believe in climate change. So I feel like, the teaching a lesson aspect, it doesn't really compare to like the damage that he would do as president. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
So thank you. Thank you for your kind words. First of all, I would highly recommend reading the reports of credible human rights organizations that are writing about the situation. So above all, I would really recommend that people read the Human Rights Watch reports and also just their reporting on what's happening now in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Yeah, ICJ advisory opinion.
The ICJ advisory opinion is definitely worth reading. The reports of Amnesty International are worth reading. And in terms of daily news sources, I mean, Al Jazeera has been by far the best reporting on what's happening in Gaza. Most Western news all Western news organizations don't have people on the ground in Gaza. There's some that have a couple of fixers that they're using. I think Democracy Now! Has a lot of good guests on and it's not just sound bites, it has really in-depth conversations. There's good reporting in Jewish Currents magazine. With respect to Trump, absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm just trying to be, I'm trying to address the fact that often people are presenting these arguments as though there's only costs on one side and there's only benefits on one side. And the truth is it's a mixed picture. As I say, Trump will be even narrowly just for Palestinians, Trump will be worse. There's no question for me about that. But I don't want to deny the fact that there could be a long-term benefit of a president losing over this issue because of the long-term implications, because we see that how much AIPAC has benefited from being able to say this congressman lost his job because he was too critical of Israel, and you all are going to pay attention. Every future congressman is going to pay attention. They're going to watch their step, and so to have something at the presidential level happen like that in the other direction for the first time ever would be a major shift. It would be something with real consequences. Again, narrowly on Israel-Palestine. There are many other issues in the world. There are many domestic things to consider. And even narrowly on Israel-Palestine, I'm not denying for a second that Trump would be worse. But I just want to say that, to the extent that people are thinking about the uncommitted movement, that there is a legitimate argument that there would be some benefit from Harris losing if it could be shown that she did so because of Gaza.
Yeah, very much. Okay, I should note that our department, political science, is holding a series of informal discussions on the elections, October 18th, with my colleague, Professor Latsavada, and we're going to be talking about the foreign policy implications of the election. Happy to give more information on that. I think this really, I mean, thanks a lot to Nathan Thrall, of course. But also, I think this really was an example of the type of productive, open discussions we need. And so I hope we just get many more of these. Thank you.
Thank you to Jonathan.
The book sold out, sorry. You did well.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.